And now we are going to experience one person's recollection of the events at that time of the camps, and in particular the time after the camps. And her perspective is very unique. Aiko Herzig Yoshinaga plays a central role in the redress movement that occurred during the 1970s and during the Reagan administration, when the federal government made an apology to the Japanese community for the actions during World War II, and both an apology and a monetary settlement. Aiko played a central role on that committee that was bringing forth evidence to show the members of the federal government that their actions at that time were based on hysteria and in particular on racism. And there was no basis whatsoever to consider these people disloyal in any manner, and that the actions of forcibly evacuating and incarcerating them was an injustice. So we'll first hear Aiko talking about her experience as a young woman, 17 years old, being taken from Los Angeles, where she was a student at Los Angeles High School, and then her first experiences in the camp. But then, importantly, what was going on after the camp experience, those first few years, just how difficult it was for this one person in particular. And you can, draw your own conclusions what it must have been like for the 110,000 people, and by that point it was now 120,000 people who had been incarcerated simply because of the birth rate within the camps that had increased so much. So please continue to listen. Aiko has a unique story, and her memory is as clear as if it were yesterday. And I'll be back at the conclusion of her remarks. Thank you.
41, the year the war broke out. That was December 41, right? Yeah, it was December 7th. I was going to high school, Los Angeles High School. I was in the graduating class to be graduated in the springtime of 1942. And that's right, we heard the news. I'm sure it would happen to be on a weekend. We heard the news on the radio at a party, and it was all, of course, a great shock to us, and we weren't, at that moment, we didn't know how it would affect us, but we knew it would affect us and our families, because the enemy at the time, on that day, was Japan, and our parents were Japanese, were from Japan. So we knew somehow it would affect us. We had no idea what that meant, actually. So there was a mixture of fear and question about what it would mean in our lives. I think that because the language barrier prevented me from discussing this with my parents, especially my mother, who didn't speak English, and I didn't speak Japanese, very little. So we didn't have a discussion about this. We just had to wait for the government to do what it will to our people, to Japanese and Japanese Americans who lived here. My father was not a prominent person in the community, so he was not apprehended by the government authorities for detention. He was a very strong Christian. So I don't know if that had anything to do with the fact that they left him alone. I doubt it, because I know that many Christian ministers were picked up and detained in government facilities. Well, at that time, we got in the spring of '42, we got word through notices nailed onto telephone poles in the streets of Los Angeles, all over the city, that persons who lived in certain areas, and they would precisely say what area of Los Angeles would be sent somewhere, would need to meet at a particular spot on a certain day to be removed from their homes in Los Angeles. If you lived on the east side of Los Angeles, middle Los Angeles, a business section, or a residential area in the west side, you are all going to be sent to different places. At that time, I was all of 17 years old, and the boyfriend that I had at the time lived on the east side of Los Angeles, while I was way over on the west side. Mm-hmm. So when we found out that our families would be going to different places, and we didn't know where, I have no idea where it would be. So in the rush of and panic, being fearful that I would be separated from my then boyfriend, we eloped. He was like all of 19 and I was all of 17 or something like that. We eloped so that I could go with his family to wherever they were being sent. We were sent to Manzanar, which was at that particular time an assembly center. It was eventually turned into a permanent relocation, quote, concentration camp. Whereas my family were sent to Santa Anita, the horse race stables, and eventually they were moved to Arkansas, a permanent war relocation authority, WRA, permanent camp. So I ended up first in Manzanar with my husband's family, and a year later in Manzanar I gave birth to my first daughter. When eventually I received word that my family, which had been relocated to Arkansas, sent me word that my father was desperately ill. So I asked to be transferred to Arkansas, where he was, in order to be close to him. I eventually did get there in December, the early part of December, 1943. And my father died about 10 days after I arrived in Arkansas. At least I got to see him, and he got to see my first daughter. The camp administrators would not allow my then husband to be transferred also to Arkansas because they claimed that the man who was ill was not his father but my father. So they were not going to allow him to move from Manzanar to California. But eventually, after working at it for half a year, he was allowed to come to Arkansas. But at the time, the Japanese American young men ages 17 and older were being drafted to serve the United States in the United States Armed Forces. And no sooner than my husband was transferred from Manzanar to Arkansas, he was drafted to serve in the Armed Forces. Speak of adding insult to injury, that was a very strong indication of what the government was doing, making such a terrible mistake. First, placing those of us who just happened to be born into this ethnic group into camp just due to our ancestry, and then drafting our young men to serve serve the government that imprisoned us. Speak of being insulted and testing our loyalty to the country. Boy, what more evidence do you need than for us to question the promises of the Constitution, which we had certainly obeyed. We were a very law-abiding group of people. That was very hurtful. At any rate, the camp life was terrible, mostly because I think the biggest loss we faced was our freedom. Never appreciated what freedom meant until there was no way we could just leave the camps, which were surrounded by barbed wires and watched over by military police, to prevent us from leaving the camps. That's the same as a prison. There was no question about it. And then to have our young men being drafted to serve actions against them. The camp life was so confining, and although our young folks did not suffer the material losses that our parents did, it was still, as I said earlier, the lack of freedom that hurt us a lot. Well, the government decided eventually to allow young folks to continue their education if they were able to get an invitation from a university to attend the school. So many young folks took advantage of that and were able to leave the camps to go to these schools with the promise that there would be some other non-Japanese family who would be responsible for us. I would like to have done that, but I was pregnant and was not able to take advantage of that offer. However, after leaving the camp after having my daughter in Manzanar, California, moving to Arkansas camp to be with my father before he passed away, eventually leaving the camp in 1944. And I left at first and I went to Denver, Colorado, because my in-laws had relocated themselves into Denver. But it was very difficult for me to make ends meet. And so I moved to Los Angeles, where more of my relatives lived. And very fortunately, just the very day that I arrived there, I bumped into one of my relatives who invited me to live with them. How lucky I was, very lucky, because I had no idea where we would be sleeping that very evening. So I had a very nice family, in-laws, where they had invited me to live there with my daughter Jerry, and they were also willing to keep an eye on little young Jerry while I went to school. And I entered an institute called the Stenotype Institute, where I learned to take dictation on a little machine called the Stenotype machine. It was a good thing I learned that, because that helped me many years afterwards to keep a job. I would always work in offices, starting with office clerk, filing papers, and eventually taking dictation, and then working for usually health-related organizations. And I worked my way up from file clerk to secretary to assistant director of the International Health section, and then eventually being assigned as a representative for the organization at the United Nations, representing this national health organization. It was a very good experience for me to be working at the United Nations. Made a lot of contacts. It was something I would have stayed with a long time if I had been able to. And eventually, though, I had to leave for whatever reason it was, and I got other jobs including working in a jazz-oriented organization, often as well as doing a lot of typing work on scripts for productions, whether they're musical productions or any other kind of play. All of it was very good for me, and laid a groundwork for an eventual job with the United Church of Christ, where I worked my way up to becoming a representative of the health organization at various meetings and at the UN. Those days were days of experimentation for me, but it was really very good. It gave me a good background. And especially when I worked for the jazz organization as Jazzmobile's office manager. I had a chance to meet some very famous jazz people, to be surrounded by almost always very upbeat people. It was, and black, which is a good experience for me. I enjoyed that a lot. And then when I joined the church organization, that also expanded my experience and contacts. So now where am I? I'm just finishing. I'm losing track of the timeline.
And working with the jazz organization, the Jazzmobile, but also working with the health organization through the United Church of Christ.
Yeah, and United Church of Christ. Eventually, I ended up again in New York because my family had moved to New York from the camps. And that was also good for me, naturally, because my family was able to watch my kids. And I got married somewhere along the line, for the second time. Yes, my second husband was in the Army, serving he was a linguist, and we got married, and he was sent to Japan from the multilingual school, and I enjoyed going to. Oh, we went to Japan and lived in a beautiful area near Kyoto. And Kyoto is famous for being not only a beautiful place, but the original capital of Japan, I think, was Kyoto. Which of course moved to Tokyo later. The capital moved to Tokyo. But I lived near Kyoto in an Army-sponsored housing complex just south of Kyoto in an area called Otsu. And Otsu, where we lived in the mountains, looked out over a beautiful lake, famously known as Lake Biwa. It was a gorgeous place, and I was so fortunate to have been stationed there in the most envied place, and made a lot of Army friends, but we were not encouraged to to become too friendly with the local Japanese people, because the nature of my husband's Army work at the time was to ferret out communists in the Japanese community. And so the Army did not encourage us to mix in with the local population, because it would make it harder for my husband's work. So I regret very much that period where I thought I had a chance to know the Japanese people better. However, we were lucky enough to be situated in a part of Japan that was famous for its beauty, and to be located specifically in Lake Otsu, where the lake was nationally known as one of the most beautiful places in Japan. Well, in 1954, I'm quite sure that's the year, we were returned to the United States, where my husband was transferred to Washington State. I think there was near, what was the name of the camp? I forgot what the Camp Washington. At any rate, so we ended up there for a little while. But then, what was the reason? I think I moved to New York with a job to work to make ends meet. So I moved to New York, and my family was good enough to help me raise the kids and to help me take care of the kids. Now, so see, we were, the husband and I were separated for a long time, and he eventually called me and said, you know, I want to get remarried, so would you be good enough to give me a divorce? I said, sure, you know, we weren't living together anyway, so we were divorced, and we've been friends. We were friends for a long time even after that, but he passed away some years ago. But I was glad that we had a good relationship because it affected the kids a lot. I think if separated or divorced parents can keep in touch with each other, and the kids could have good feelings about their parents, so I thought that was important. I was grateful for his attitude about that. Yeah. Now, after that, how long was it now? Oh, I know, when we were in Japan, we had made good family. We were good family friends with Jack Herzig and his wife. We used to see each other a lot at the Officers Club and get together once in a while for picnics. And during that long period, when Davis and I were separated, Jack lost his wife, and so he was free, and he was single. And during that period, it was 76, 77, 78, he got back in touch with me, and by that time, Davis and I were divorced, and he got in touch. We were in touch by Christmas cards and from occasional telephone calls anyway. But he called me one day and said, I'm here in New York, and let's go out to lunch. So we picked up our friendship again there, and by 1978, we decided that I should move down to Washington, where Jack was working at the Pentagon. I think it was still at the Pentagon. And so we lived in Virginia, adjacent to Washington, and had a nice life there. We were there for a long time, 50-something years altogether on the East Coast. My time on the East Coast, and then we decided to move to California to be with my side of the family. Since Jack had no sisters or brothers, or didn't have ties to any families, so it was good for him to have. Then he liked the temperature, the climate much better in California. So we moved to California, and unfortunately he passed away not that long after we had moved to California. So that brought us up to year 220, what is that, the 2004, 2005 when he passed away. Now, what happened after 2005? Since I was with my family, I was very fortunate. In a terrible night, I'm trying to think what I did first when I moved out here. Did I ever mention to you what it was that I was doing when I first moved out here?
No. When you first moved out here, it was really just connected with relocating out here with Jack in order to be close to your family that had been out here then.
Yeah, right. So I picked up the threads with my family, and it's been a good life then, since I was pretty close to all my family members. It's been good.
Aiko, let me ask you, when you were in Manzanar
Yes.
with Jerry, you got word that your father was seriously ill. You petitioned and got permission to go to, is it Jerome?
Yeah,
Arkansas?
Jerome first.
How did you get from Manzanar to Jerome with Jerry?
We took a train. I took a train, and I don't remember. It seemed to be days and days before we got there. But there was no seat on the train. And so I was sitting with Jerry on my lap, sitting on my suitcase for a couple of days, I think, or at least a day or two. And eventually, a soldier gave up his seat. He said, "Here, you take this seat." He was very generous to give up his seat. So I was able to use that seat for the rest of the trip. And then when we got off the train in Arkansas, there was a bus. Bus was waiting to take those of us who had to go into the camp to Jerome Relocation Center, quote, relocation. When we got there, they dropped us off at the barracks. We were shown the building which was to be our home. It was a bare tar paper barrack. Yeah. And at first, there were 3 of us families living together in one room. One family had a little daughter, or a sister-in-law with her husband had a little daughter. Another brother, older brother, my husband's another brother, and his wife, newly married, and then Jacob and me, newly married. So there were 3 different families in one room. And as I recall, the room was about 20 by 20 feet. we had separated our living space by hanging blankets between two of the, divided the one room into 3 separate rooms, and that was our abode for several months until they allowed us to have our own little space. So it was a good thing we all got along, because it's not very easy to have 2 newly married couples and another family with a baby all in one room sharing the space, little space. When I think about it, I think, gee, it's a wonder, it was a good thing we got along so well. It would have been pretty tough if we did not respect each other. And it was a very difficult time for us to make adjustments. And of course, one of the hardest things was the lack of being able to make your own food, your own meals. There were, as I recall, about 36 blocks, separate blocks in Manzanar. That did not include the hospital, I think, or the administrative offices. And we happened to live in block 6. Each block had 12 or 13 barracks. Yeah, I think it was 13, because the 13th was a recreation hall. 14th was a mess hall. We lived in a block 12, building 13, apartment 2. Yeah, that's what it, 12, 13, 2. And there was, the lack of privacy was bad enough, but then to have to line up for every single meal, particularly older people or people who were ill and had to have their meals brought home to them if they could not make it to the mess hall. 3 meals a day, waiting in line, no matter what the temperature was, no matter if there was a dust storm. It ain't easy. And to do that every day. Well, we were fortunate that the weather was bad from time to time, but on the whole, I think we were lucky. We were very lucky. So that was Manzanar. In Arkansas, the weather was not really very good. It was an area of Arkansas that was swampy and sticky, especially in the summer, and full of bugs. That was something that I didn't enjoy at all. So I was glad when they decided to close that one camp. But then we got moved to another camp in another part of Arkansas, which is not much better. But at any rate, from the second Arkansas camp, when they started to close all the camps, I moved to Denver, Colorado. And I tried living there with another Japanese-American Nisei woman whose husband also was in armed services. And it was just too difficult trying to live very, very cramped quarters with another woman and her son. So moved myself back to California. And fortunately, my brother-in-law, through marriage, I bumped into the day we got there, and he invited me and Jerry to come and live with his family. And that was so generous, especially when they already had 20 people living in their one house.
Right.
Boy, imagine being so big-hearted that you offer to share your home and the food and everything else. And such a generous family. I was so fortunate. I was so lucky that I just worked to my advantage.
Mm-hmm.
And so I moved there, and they helped to take care of Jerry while I went to school and worked at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was so fortunate. Eventually, I had to move back to New York.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I forget what the reason was at the time, but anyway, so my kids all grew up in New York.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So they didn't have the advantage of knowing other Japanese Americans.
Mm-hmm.
So they had quite an adjustment to make when eventually they've all moved back to the Southern California. But it was a good experience, I think, for them to grow up in New York and to know people other than Japanese Americans. It was, I think, a good thing for them. Yeah. So.
Let me ask you, I'm going to go back to that question. So on this train trip from Manzanar to Jerome, you had a ticket, presumably, but there was no seat for you.
Yes.
And so it was on a passenger train, and you were forced to sit on your suitcase
Yes.
in the car, the passenger car,
Yeah.
without a seat.
Yeah, that's right. And that's when eventually a soldier gave up his seat for
Right.
me, and he took the suitcase and he allowed me to sit on his seat, which made it easier for me to change Jerry's diapers. It was very hard trying to work it with only on a suitcase, you know. Yeah, but it was so generous of the soldier. I really appreciated it. Yeah, because it was a long trip, as I recall. Yeah.
Was there anything else that you encountered from people? Because you weren't under a guard, you just were under your own, I would say, I hate to use this word, recognizance. They said, get on the train and then get off in Jerome, is that right? And there was no special protection?
When we got off the train in Jerome, near Jerome, they put us on a bus.
Right.
So
But you
we went on
basically-
the bus.
But you were all by yourself with Jerry on
Yeah.
that train.
Right. Right. Yeah, it was a little tough.
Yeah. But could you have gone anywhere? Let's say, I don't want to go to Jerome, I want to go.
No, I had to carry an identification.
Okay.
So, I don't know if I would have been stopped by anybody. But since we were afraid and we didn't know Arkansas at all, I wouldn't know where to go. So, the only thing to do is to do what the the police say we have to do. Yeah. It was a little scary.
Right. When you got to Jerome, and then as you said, 10 days later, your father passed away. What was your mother's situation at that time and going forward?
Yeah, my mother was not well because she had had sort of a nervous breakdown. But She handled it very well, I thought. And I had a older sister there with their family. So she had moral support as well. So, but you know, the Japanese people are not all that emotional. They don't show their emotions. My mother was just like that. Yeah. All I have is a picture of the family funeral. I have the people who knew my father, who was in the camp. So I don't have very much. I didn't have a chance to pick up our relationship, which was not very close, but since he died so quickly, you know, yeah. He had a cardiac problem, plus other major organs, but I don't know if he would have died if we didn't go to camp anyway, because of his health. However, it was not easy, you know, to deal with on top of everything else. Yeah.
Well, once again, thank you very much for taking the time to listen to these very perceptive individuals, these women who had their own experience or the experience of their mothers or grandmothers in the camps during World War II, and in particular, those years immediately after the camp. And so while the camp experience ended in the mid-40s, the trauma and the difficulties that the camp experience put on them, that the federal government and our society put on these people, continued for many years afterwards. And I dare say, reverberates through the Japanese American community today, more than 70 years later. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you again on future programs. Goodbye.